So some years ago, I was at a temple, a Buddhist temple from the Tibetan tradition, and they had a young monk there who was a tulku, an incarnate lama, and everybody spoke in sort of very hushed tones about this young guy and what he'd achieved, and there was this sort of atmosphere around that we had somebody very special in our midst and stuff. So I thought I'd have a chat with him and just make sure that he knew what he was talking about. So I made an appointment to go and see him, and I went to see him. And what I wanted to talk to him about was the way that we do things in Triratna, in the sense that we're not monastic, and I wanted him to answer the question, how necessary is it to be a monk and to live a monastic life. Um, and he said, the Buddha said that to be a Buddhist, you have to be a monk, broadly speaking. And I found myself saying to him, well, I know you're enlightened and all that, but that can't be true, can it? Because uh, your tradition is something like 8th century, and it goes back a long way before that, long after the Buddha died and so on. And he said to me, you don't understand the nature of Buddha. And I thought, I heard that actually. And of course, what he was saying is that the historical Buddha, the figure of the historical Buddha, has become so much wider now, and is surrounded by mythology, and has come to represent spiritual faculties and features and so forth, which the historical Buddha, of course, couldn't lay claim to. So I just want to start by just kind of reminding us that when we talk of the Buddha, um, we talk about much more than the historical character of Siddhartha Gautama. However, uh, that is the person that I want to say something about tonight. And the brief for my talk is to say something about the way that this character has sort of influenced me and inspired me. So that's my intention. In order to do that, to make sense of it, I feel that I need to tell you something about me and my life and my experience, because I think, needs to be spoken about in that context, so that I can say, look, I was inspired by this particular thing, and you might say, well, of course you would be, because that's the sort of person you are, and that's the sort of conditions that you were in, and that's why that particular teaching or that particular action made more sense to you. Because it may not make sense to you, but of course, we've arrived at this place in our lives through different routes, haven't we? But hopefully, there's something in the stories that I'm going to relay on. There's something in this figure of the Buddha that you do have some sort of relationship to. And when we break into the small groups, maybe something you could share with the other people in your group. So I always start, if I'm going to give a little talk like this. Actually, I think this is going to be more of a ramble than a talk. I've got some things that I want to say, but I can't work out which order they need to go in. So I'm just going to have to just sort of launch and see where we go. Um, I usually do it like that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that I can say something that might be of interest tonight. Yeah, so but I always start by saying, by just expressing my gratitude and appreciation to those people that made these teachings available to me and these practices available to me. And it's very relevant, isn't it? Because I can start with Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, who became awake, who became the enlightened one. because he took the trouble, thank goodness, to try and explain and describe the experience that he'd had to other people. And when he did that, one or two of them kind of got it and understood and practiced it themselves. And then they told other people, and then they passed it on, and then they passed it on. And eventually, over 2,500 years, which seems like a long time, but actually it's not that long really. I don't know how many teachers there are between, my main teacher, Sangharakshita, and the Buddha. It's not thousands. You so this has got sort of down to me, you know, somehow or other. Well, not somehow or other. People have taken the trouble to pass it on, and in my case, included amongst those people are especially Maitreya Bandhu, to whom I've got nothing but gratitude, and Vimalachita, who's sitting here with us. Vimalachita was one of the first people I met when I walked into the Buddhist Center at Bethnal Green. It's like a miracle that we've washed up in the same so I feel very grateful for that. So I think I'll start there. My relationship to the historical Buddha is based on that sense of gratitude. I think you need that. So we start then with this character. So the story is, and just remember that it's a story, and that these things these stories are metaphors. They're pointing us towards something. If it turned out that it wasn't true, or if it turned out even if it turned out, oh, historians have now proved there was no such person, it doesn't really matter. Someone somewhere has had these experiences and they made them available to us. So we'll say that it's this guy, yeah? Siddhartha Gautama. Actually, apparently, it's highly likely there was such a person. He was said to be a member of the Shakyan community or tribe back in those times, born in what's now Nepal. It sounds like there was such a person. And the story really of his enlightenment begins with what's described as the four sights. So the story is embellished, of course. It's said that he was never outside of his palace gates until one day he managed to get shown around the town. And when he was there, he saw a corpse, a dead person, somebody who was old, somebody who was sick, and he saw a monk or a holy man. And these sights, the first three in particular, arose in his mind, well, let's say, doubt about the life that he was living and the way that people were living. So he was said to be very comfortable, very wealthy. All his needs were sort of taken care of. He had doting parents. We're in Stroud. We see that a lot, don't we? And this was the circumstances in which he was in. And yet, on the basis of old age, sickness, and death, none of it really made any sense. So what we've got with this character is a questioner. He very much wanted to make sense of things, to find meaning in things. And on the basis that, well, we get old, we get sick, and we die, it doesn't seem to be very meaningful. So there's got to be more to it. So we're going to hear a bit more about what he did about that, but we can call it going forth. He set out on this kind of quest. So when I was a child, I think that, well, no, I'll say this wider. I think children, when they're small, do ask these questions, don't they? We sort of. I remember very vaguely. I think this is more of an attitude or a sort of a feeling tone than anything else. Being taught about the planet. Oh, by the way, if I'm talking too loudly, could someone let me know? You know how you get old people when they're on the telephone. That's me. So if I'm talking too loudly, just go like that or something, and I'll try to kind of. So I remember somebody, I think it was my grandfather maybe, trying to tell me about the stars, astronomy. And he would say, oh, and this is Mars, and then this planet goes around there, and that relation, and it spins so many times. And I remember thinking, I'm not interested in this, but it's all made up. What do you mean? It's not Mars, is it? You just called it Mars. What I want to know is, what is Mars? What are planets? What is the universe? My question was, what the hell's going on here? Yeah, I've been born. I seem to have been born into this thing. What does any of it mean? Ruby, you can't hear me? Can everyone else hear me? Sorry, Ruby, I think it must be you. So, yeah, it's that. I remember my grandson George. We were down by the sea. He lives down by the sea, and he was asking me. He said, "What is it?" So I get into all this thing. Oh well, it's a body of water, and it's drawn by precipitation, and moisture gets drawn up into clouds, and it moves and it falls down. And he looked at me. That's not what he meant. What he meant is, what is it? I mean, what is any of it? So I had that kind of mind when I was a child for a while. Yeah. But there comes a point, of course, when you stop asking those questions because no one knows. I always thought that there might come a day eventually my father would sit me down and sort of explain to me the meaning of life. But of course he never did. I think it was somehow tied up with sex, maybe. I knew there was I thought there was a secret everyone knew except me. Yeah, perhaps there is. Anyway, so that was so that was something that I related to when I heard this story of the foresight and it stimulating the Buddha to do something. So what did he do? Well, I mean, he took action. Yeah? He didn't mess about. He shaved his head. He gave away all his posh, expensive clothes. He said goodbye to his wife and sleeping child. He left the palace and he wandered off, yeah? Wearing nothing but a robe, with no money, and just a bowl, and so forth, in a quest, in a mission to try to make some kind of sense of this world, of this life that he'd been given. I was very taken with that. It wasn't that he couldn't come Wednesday because he had a yoga class. Yeah, he wasn't messing around. This guy, he wasn't messing around. He was going for it. He was absolutely going for it, uncompromising, taking no prisoners, out into the jungle to the most scary place that he could find, challenging himself at every turn. So I was born in the early 1950s, 1952 to be precise. So the Second World War had a lot of influence on me because it wasn't long, that before I was around and became conscious. So I've got very clear memories of being in my grandmother's kitchen. Everyone used to gather there on a Saturday morning in my family, hearing stories about the Blitz and we was poor but we was happy and all that sort of thing. And I was sort of um, I was kind of as a child expecting that my war would be next. Yeah. So my father had fought his war, my grandfather had fought his war, or actually, it's another story. I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. And I was really taken with this, that life was, this idea of a quest, of good defeating evil, was very much in the sort of the myth for me as I was growing up. My grandfather was very influential. Just this is just an aside, really. He always told me, question everything. Yeah, question everything. I mean, I'll give you a flavour. During the First World War, um, he um, he joined the army. I think he was about 17, and he said he didn't realise that Belgium was abroad until he was on the boat. People didn't weren't educated. He said, and when I got over there, he said it was muddy and everyone kept shouting at me, so I came home. Right? So he just said, oh, he wasn't going to do that. So he just got lost in the chaos, got on a train, and spent the First World War hiding in my grandmother's coal cellar. This is a guy who would not would not basically toe the line. He would ask questions. He would ask questions, and and that had a cost to him. So this notion of a quest, of something to overcome, something to battle, was very much in my sort of DNA, and that I really related to the Buddha's story um, about um, about his quest, you know, about his search for meaning. So he took things very seriously, and one gets the impression during that time that there were a lot of these guys. Well, in fact, there still are. I met a bloke when I was in India who'd been holding his arm up in the air for 9 years. I don't know why. It's something to do with overcoming the body, seeming to get to the spirit, something like that. This is a tradition. He had very long fingernails. His arm was all withered. So this is the sort of thing. Um, this is the sort of thing that people would do, and he was involved in that. I'm looking down here because I've got a quote somewhere. So one of the things he decided to do, for instance, is to stop breathing. He thought, now if I stop breathing, maybe I'll find something outside of the body. I had terrible winds pushing up in my head as if a strong man were twisting a sharp knife or fastening a turban round my head with a leather strap. I had terrible winds cutting through the abdomen as if a skilled butcher were cutting through it with a sharp butcher's knife. I had a terrible burning sensation in my body as if two strong men were to grab a weaker man by his two arms and roast him in a pit of hot coals. So yeah, these things have a cost. Yeah, that appealed to me also for some reason. So they eventually made me go to school. I knew I was going to have to go to school, and I didn't know I was going to have to go back again the next day. I can remember that quite clearly. I thought that's it. Then I've done school, but no, I had to go there for another 7 years or something like that. I felt that I was being held against my will. In fact, I was being held against my will, and I did battle with it. I did my very best to do battle with it, and it was a nightmare, of course. So I would always refuse to do homework, for instance. I just thought, you've got me till 3 o'clock, and after that, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not having any more of it. So so I had that kind of attitude. So by the time I was 15, my kind of battleground were the football terraces, and I threw myself into that with some zealous energy. So yeah, I was a battler. I was a fighter. Uh, as in a way was the Buddha. Or at least Siddhartha Gautama was. So he went through all these austerities. He put himself through enormous kind of strains and so forth. And at one point, he he decided that he would only eat the grain of rice a month, I think it was. So as you can imagine, that had a price, and he ended up by being not very well. And the story is that he one day he kind of collapsed, and along comes a young woman described as a milkmaid who gave him some milk to drink, and slowly but surely he kind of revived. And I think the metaphor is that kindness, that act of kindness, and it were, saved the day. And sometime around then, he had this very clear memory of a time when he was a child, that when he was sitting under a rose apple tree, and he remembers just in that moment being just perfectly happy and content, and everything was okay. Yeah? He wasn't striving, he wasn't overcoming anything, he wasn't he was just open to his experience, and in that moment everything was okay. And I think that that of course was the turning point, and he began to then move beyond these practices of austerity to a different kind of approach. So when I was a kid, my father used to wake me up in the middle of the night to listen to Muhammad Ali beating people up on the radio. So boxing came from America, and of course, so it was the middle of the night. It's all very exciting. But Muhammad Ali was one of my early heroes. Now, I know everyone knows who he is. All I can tell you is at the time, there'd never been anything like him. He was he was marvelous. He was absolutely he was an Adonis. If you watch him boxing in those early times when he was still young, he was incredible. No one could touch him. You couldn't touch him. It was impossible to punch him. He just could move with such fluidity and so forth. He was a god to Muhammad Ali, and people hated him. Um, like my dad. Yeah, he was just a bit more acceptable than Mick Jagger. Yeah, but not much. He was mouthy. He was cocky. He was black. And he beat our man Henry Cooper, who came from not far from where we lived. That was a serious crime. This is not going to mean much to anybody. But the thing about Muhammad Ali, then, so he was a fighter. He was prepared to, put himself out there, uh, and so forth, in the way that the Buddha was, in the way that my myth worked for me. And they called him up to fight in the American army, and go to Vietnam. And he said, "No, I'm not going. Yeah, I'm not going." There's this incredible thing where you see him, the film of him. He's at the recruitment station, and the sergeant says, "Step forward." When you step forward, you're in the army, and everyone stepped forward but him. So there was something there. So this is a guy who could fight. Huh? He had that as an option, but he chose not to. Yeah? He chose to prioritize authenticity, and decency, and his principles over and above his personal gain. And it cost him dearly. They took his license away. He couldn't fight. By the time he got back into the ring, he was 3 or 4 years older, and he was never the same. But so there we are. So he was a hero of mine. I was very much inspired by him. And there was something in that story which resonated for me with the Buddha's experience under the rose apple tree. There was something, there was another way to go. Yeah, you could still strive, and you could still move towards something. You could still carry on with your search for meaning, but you could do it in a different way. Uh, and of course, in Muhammad Ali's case, I suppose we're talking about ethics. The other thing that Muhammad Ali had was religion. So there was something about that that resonated for me, and I made that connection when I hear the story of the Buddha. Somebody else of around the same era was Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King had a similar kind of an attitude. He put himself up there. He spoke out against wrong and injustice, but he did it from a place of love and refused to be drawn into fighting and so forth. So Martin Luther King was also something of a hero of mine as I came into my later teenage years. Um, and the thing about Martin Luther King was that he had a dream. Yeah. If you've never heard that speech, phew, it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. So he had a vision. Yeah. He had something that was more important in the end than his own life. And of course, all this cost him his life, as you'll know. Uh, and so that these two people, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King, who saw a different way, if you like, of fighting and of striving, um, and who was acting on the basis of a vision of something greater than, more than all his ordinary, everyday sort of sense of himself and his life. And I see those qualities in the story of the Buddha's journey towards enlightenment. Yeah. So, what happened? Well, so eventually the Buddha gets himself under the Bodhi tree after a few more adventures. And he has a resolution. He sits down, so I'm going to sit here until I reach perfect enlightenment. Yeah. So he had this vision. Maybe didn't quite know what it was. Uh, I don't quite know what it is, but there's something in it somehow or other. I don't know. I seem to have spent 25 years sort of broadly pursuing something or other. I don't know. Hopefully it will manifest at some point. So he sat down under this tree and he closed his eyes and he entered into various depths of meditation and so forth. And there's lots could be said about that, but the thing I want to draw out is that at some point he was attacked by Mara's army. So Mara is this character who really represents the difficulties and the hindrances to us in our spiritual life. And when the arrows were fired at him, he turned them into flowers and they fell harmlessly to the ground. Yeah. So for me, um, what I pursued were drugs. So in the language of going for refuge, I went for refuge to to drugs during those late teenage years. So by now, I was quite convinced that the love and peace and the hippie era had come along and that sort of thing. So I threw myself wholeheartedly into the world of drugs. And well, of course, it ended in tears. but and I just want to make clear, I'm not advocating the use of drugs in any shape, manner, or form. Um, but it wasn't all negative. Yeah. What I learned there was that the state of one's mind um, is variable. Mm? We're not fixed with a particular state of mind. So, and especially with psychotropics like acid and so forth, it's quite, my God, the world as you think it is not necessarily like that. So I learned that. By the time I was in my sort of early 40s, this attitude that I had of doing battle, of fighting, of pushing on, had got me to a situation where I had been, I was a senior manager in this local government department. I had a big house and a Italian car, and I had all that, wife and two kids, and I was snorting a gram of cocaine a day, roughly. So this experience that the Buddha had when came to learn about it, um, that things were, even when you kind of made, as it were, a success of life in a conventional sense, they were always going to be unsatisfactory, at least to some degree. So by the time the Buddha stood up from this seat under the Bodhi tree, he came away and he started to tell people about something about his experience. And he said there are four noble truths. So the first is that things are unsatisfactory in ordinary everyday life terms. You can have fun, you can have joy, all those things can happen, um, but they're never quite enough. This kind of search for meaning is never quite sort of properly met. Dukkha apparently relates to some, etymologically, to the ill-fitting wheel of a cart. You know that feeling? No matter what you do, you wanted to have this holiday and you really look forward to it, and finally, and you got there, and then there was sand in the sandwiches, and it wasn't quite right. It wasn't quite right. It's never quite right, is it? You know, you open the Christmas packet looks so enticing. You open it all up. Oh God, you've already got socks. Yeah. So it's like it's something like that. So I thought, ah, this person has some sort of sense that I already have. That's how I experience life. It's not quite right. Something's wrong here. It's not quite working. Yeah? And it was such a sense of relief to hear to hear that the Buddha had said this, because it meant that it's not me. It's not me that's doing things wrong. It's not me that can't make a go of it. This is how it is. And he says that the cause of that, the reason for that, is that we are constantly in a situation of craving. We're constantly wanting something that to fill us up. We're trying to push away something that we don't want. And by this time, I couldn't stop snorting cocaine. I was done. And so I absolutely understood that. Hilary, I noticed you scratch your nose there. That's what I do when I talk about cocaine. I go like that. I don't know if that means anything to you, but anyway. So uh, yeah. So the notion that that things were unsatisfactory, that craving and wanting was the cause of it, that there was something more than that, that there was an end to that, which is the third noble truth, which, as I say, I kind of never lost hope in, not entirely, almost, but not entirely. And then the third was that there is a path leading to the cessation of that craving. And by then, because I was so utterly convinced of the truth of those first three truths, noble truths, I was up for going along with what was being suggested. So this path was basically meditation, ethics, and wisdom, and I was absolutely up for that. So the Buddha said, "This is what you do. Don't worry too much about all understanding it and other. Just do these things." And on the basis of doing those things, then you you're encouraged to, as it were, pursue them and do them more. So you do the practices, you have a response to them, enough to kind of drive you on to do them again. And slowly but surely, the craving began to drop away from me. I overcame that awful situation I was in, with addiction, or at least up until today. Um, Things began to get better. Yeah. So increasingly, I have faith in that. So somewhere out there, there's this myth of this guy who took on the quest for meaning, who found a way in which to work with life to make it, in a sense, have some sort of purpose attached to it, and that's driven me, and increasingly does. And I think I'd say that, yeah, I have days when I don't want to be involved in it and all that sort of thing, but I've never really lost confidence in it. So that's just something about this guy, this character, the sorts of things that he got up to, the kinds of teachings that he did, and the way in which I've related to it and, well, followed it. So